and portraits. Portraits always have a kind of mask-like character, and masks that takes us in other directions that John is interested, like the masks of ancient theater, which were meant to either to heighten or to intensify certain personal characteristics, or carnival masks, or such kind of thoughts. Carnival masks, which of course were meant as disguises and meant to allow for a space in which one could release one's inhibitions. All these parts play in endless series of portraits, some of which are quite readable. Notice even the handprint on the clown mask over there, and the red blob at the end, where is that? Well, there's a cross in it as well, there's bleeding in it as well. How far do you want to take all of this kind of stuff? And I think John likes us to play with it. The curious thing, well, what we say, for someone who comes after abstract, radical, geometric, abstract, chromatic painting in Montreal, is John's obsession with gesture. Especially in the 1970s, when gesture was, of course, any notion of gesture as being direct expressiveness or being meaningful in that kind of way had on the whole been demolished by most postmodern criticism, that gesture was at best some kind of part of historical rhetoric which no longer was capable of carrying indirect or immediate meaning. And if you read that famous interview by Benjamin Buchloh, Gerhard Richter in 1978, I think he conducted it, where he attacks Richter's gestural painting as being nothing but an empty inventory of the rhetoric of the tradition of painting. And so in that sense, John's uninhibited gesture is interesting, because I think he thoroughly believes in its viability. He thinks of, in terms of the history it comes from, he thinks back to one of his sort of fundamental and foundational experiences, which was visiting the caves in Lascaux. Of course, the inevitable interest in Chinese and Japanese calligraphy, and also very much in abstract expressionism. And I think he has a way of phrasing that interest in the gesture of abstract expressionism, not in terms of expression per se, but he says in terms of the gesture as being a seizure of energy. And of course, it is a seizure of energy made at a particular moment by a particular person. And that seizure of energy, of course, in the experience of the viewer, is something that is capable of being re-released and re-experienced. So I think that's sort of in terms of the way to think of it. This is kind of one of the early ones from 1984 called Sign, and the gestures also, of course, have kind of sign and symbol implications. This one is done on rayon cloth, and sometime in the early 80s, he in fact purchased rolls of remainder blocks of rayon from a fabric warehouse, and it's kind of a wonderful material, kind of lustrous threads, and it has a heavy body, sort of a palpable weightiness that also enhances, of course, the double thing of being picture and object, which is a continual issue, I think, through all of John's work. I realized I jumped here, which is inexcusable. But when John entered upon this kind of painting, or as I guess the painting it still is, not only had the gesture been under attack, but painting in general had been under attack, and certainly Montreal, for the generation that came into maturity in the 70s, it was a pretty hard thing to know how one could continue painting. How could one also continue it after the kind of consummate example of the plasticien group, and everywhere various kinds of experimentation were going on. And these were the years, of course, also when Lucy Lippard published her book, this was in 1973, 6 years, The Materialization of the Art Object, and general predictions around was that art was an outmoded, that painting as well as sculpture and any of the craft traditions, were outmoded and would be superseded if not just by text and language, certainly by the new media, were the only mediums with the agility to deal with a new, complex, postmodernist world. And so painters everywhere who still wanted to be painters were experimenting with ways of dealing with this. You remember Richard Tuttle, who was simply pinned on the wall, sort of what looked like crushed polygons of fabric, colored fabric that had been pulled out again, and quite casually stacked on the walls. Alan Shields hung things from the ceiling, either kind of string paintings or similar kind of constructions. There were the Support Surpass group in France, like Viola, also playing with additional painting. And John certainly was interested in this, but you never sense, well, all this to me always reads like experimentation, youthful experimentation often. With John, I sort of never get that feeling. It always seems to me that, in a way, he's doing young man's work at this time, but it's already cured by a certain maturity, which of course may well have to do with that he was a mature man in his 30s doing this rather than someone straight out of art school. Of course, there are comparable things if you look at the hangings like Betty Goodwin's tarpaulins, which also appeared at about the same time, or Sam Gillam's stained canvases, which were also unstretched and hung from the wall. But those are a little... John moves somewhere else, because Betty Goodwin or Sam Gillam are never next fixed in place and are more or less intended to be looked at with sort of no touch of more traditional modes of formalist abstract painting. If you walked around, you'll also see that there was sculpture produced at the time. There's a kind of rod standing against that wall that in the catalog, in fact, lies on the floor. Here, I don't know who made the decision. David, did you do that? Or someone made the decision to lean it against the wall, which of course is very appropriate. But the way it leans is sort of like you're backed up against the wall and kind of sagging. It's a minimalist piece of pipe, but it embodies that sort of human characteristic. And that somewhere is also always here, however reduced the work may become. And then there are performances for camera that are photographed, and I think there are 6 or 7 of them, where John has taken these objects and used them as, and does some gesture with them, holding them, extending them, and setting himself up for the camera where they kind of become incorporated, not only the objects, not only John's handling of them, but the shadows that are cast by the light upon this configuration of artisan sculpture that become a kind of entire sculpture within itself, where and this kind of incorporating the body and other objects for works specifically made for photographs is somewhat, Caroline Schneemann was doing a similar kind of thing at the time. We could also think of Franz Erhard Walter, for example, whose canvas sculptures were also were specifically made for performance situations. Language also played a fairly important part, not in the content of the paintings, more in the way that we say John gave in hints as to how to look at the work. He had an exhibition at the Canadian Cultural Centre in Paris in 1974, where he listed simply a number of words. I'll read a few of them: connection, separation, support, surface, structure, appearance, movement, stillness, form, edge, determination, allusion, illusion, grammar, concept, idea, act. And then in my little version of it, which I must have gotten from him because he's penned in sound silence. These are words, he said, these are words that may prove useful to look with. Somewhere else he talks about diction and contradiction.